Humanity has always strived for the betterment of our species, and that progress is behind some of our most outstanding achievements. But what happens when the cruel or callous impositions of power twist the meaning of progress for profit? One horrific example occurred from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century in Scotland, a time when families were torn asunder, were forced off their ancestral lands, and watched their homes burned in the name of progress. The Highland Clearances is a deeply complex subject, so our plan is to set the stage, then give you two of the most egregious examples of what happened. First, let's look at what came before, the clan society of the Highlands. A clan was usually led by a chief. Originally an appointed head of the family, this position became increasingly hereditary over time. The rest of the kinfolk lived on the lands held by the clan and organized into small agricultural townships. Pretty much collectives or joint tenancy farms, and the croft was one such unit. The chief owned the land and leased it out to tacksmen, who in turn subleased the farms to tenant farmers or crofters. Crofters would employ workers or cotters to help cultivate a specific farm. Now, the clan system was deteriorating well before the Highland Clearances. It had often come under attack. The Highlanders, being so far north and isolated, had always given those in power in the lowlands pause. As we know very well, the Highlanders were often at odds with the southern nobility. For instance, King James I was so terrified of any uprising that he systematically called clan chiefs into attendance in court. He hoped that putting physical distance between the chiefs and their kin would promote loyalty to the crown over the chiefdom. The friction between the North and the South was both economic and, after the Protestant Reformation, often religious. It led to the uprisings of the 17th and 18th centuries when Highland clans supported the royals that they felt would give them a better deal and preserve their freedoms, the Stuarts. This all came crashing down after the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1746. After Culloden, rebellious Highlanders were explicitly targeted. Laws were established to diminish the influence of the clan chiefs and Gaelic customs. Under the Heritable Jurisdictions Act in 1747, men who refused to swear loyalty oath to the Hanoverian government found their land put up for auction. This allowed lowlanders and Englishmen to purchase large swaths of the Highlands. However, many new landowners found that these purchases were not particularly lucrative. Clan-style organizations and land use was diffuse and vague. It had been designed simply to maintain a reliable subsistence for the local population in a harsh environment. Profit, expansion, upward money flow had nothing to do with it at its core. And to modern outsiders, this just seemed backwards. How could you make the Highlands profitable? That was the question of the day. Enter one Sir John Sinclair. From all accounts, Sinclair was not predatory. Rather, he was a progressive mercantilist in the mode of John Locke. Sinclair believed that the solution to improving farming and the standard of living in the Highlands was trade. And the most powerful trade good in the British Empire at the time was wool. Everybody needed it, at home and abroad. And if the Highlands could produce it, the land would become prosperous and everybody could benefit. However, the old-fashioned farms up there didn't house large numbers of sheep, as the climate was considered too harsh for the animals. So Sinclair proposed that the Highlanders change the breed of sheep that they kept. His research suggested that the Cheviot sheep, commonly found in the border of Scotland and England, would be a perfect specimen for adapting to the windswept climate of the Highlands. The first attempt at importing and raising Cheviots was an immediate success, with 100% survival of Sinclair's imports. The next step was to slowly introduce the wool from these sheep into the Highland economy through considerate and measured changes. Sinclair proposed that tenants on small holdings maintain possession of the area while also pooling their resources together. In this way, they could build their investments with larger herds over time, at the same time gradually expanding the grazing areas. This would result in a slow, long-term return on the sheep, with monetary gains split between the landowners and the tenants. But Sinclair's well-thought-out plans fell on deaf ears. Instead, landowners hemorrhaging money in the Highlands heard one message: more land plus more sheep equals more profit. Sinclair had inadvertently started a wildfire, and the real formula became more land plus more sheep minus the people equals profit. After all, you only need a few shepherds, and you could pay them very, very little. Any other land use was just a drain. Rent from poor tenants couldn't compete with wool profits. The first clearances began in the 1780s, and the trend grew throughout the Napoleonic era. Most landlords sought to retain their tenants, but just redeploy them to the unprofitable fringes of the estates, especially coastal areas where they could work in the fishing and kelping industries. It was only later that the landlords started evicting people with little concern for where they ended up. One of the earliest and most egregious examples of the clearances occurred on the Sutherland estate between 1809 and 1821. This 1 million acre estate was owned by George Levison Gower, thanks to his marriage to the Countess of Sutherland. Initially, the state had removed a small number of tenants with an eye towards cutting out the taxman. When the new Duke of Sutherland took control, he launched a series of considerable improvements, the common term used by the landlords. Several agents were hired to carry out the evictions. The most efficient and notorious were William Young and Patrick Seller. Patrick Seller was a Scottish man with a distant relation to the Sutherland estate, but neither he nor Young spoke a lick of Scots Gaelic. This was made obvious at the beginning of their evictions in 1813, when men from Clan Gun came to Galsby to protest the arrival of massive flocks of sheep. Young met them with a force of lackeys to break up what he called a mob. Now, none of them spoke Scots Gaelic, so the Gun farmers were more confused than they were afraid. As things began to heat up, Young used his clout to call in British troops from Ireland. Ironically, their experiences on the reverse of the situation, when Scottish-born troops had suppressed Irish gatherings, made them ideal enforcers. The threat of violence sent a clear message to Clan Gun: leave without trouble, or else. In December of that year, tenants from Strathnaver journeyed to Galsby to hear their eviction notice. This time, Young employed a local minister, David Mackenzie, to translate. Mackenzie also supported the evictions through his preaching, warning tenants that they would face fire and brimstone if they resorted to unlawful resistance. Of course, during these sermons, Mackenzie never divulged the sums of money he was receiving, or where his church got the new pulpit from. An auction for the soon-to-be vacated land was set to occur directly after the notice, and only one person placed a bid: Patrick Seller, the other agent in charge of the evictions. This was his second purchase of land on the Sutherland estates, and he planned to turn a profit, no matter the cost. Often during the clearances, the land was set to fire for two reasons. First, it cleared the land for the sheep pastures. Second, it ensured that the tenants would have no home to return to. In the early days of the clearances, many tenants would partly dismantle their dwellings for supplies to build their new homes on the coast. But things were different in Strathnaver in 1814. The evictees were forbidden to dismantle their homes. Instead, the in-state enforcers stripped them for firewood. Now, Seller did pay the tenants, but they were only paid what Seller saw as a fair price for the wood. The Strathnaver tenants who refused to leave had enforcers sicked on them. Eyewitness accounts record people being chased from their homes, even as Seller and his men set the dwellings on fire. One example: William Chisholm had a hut in Strathnaver that his daughter-in-law, Janet Mackay, lived in with her mother, Margaret. Margaret was a frail, sickly old woman. When the officials came and started setting dwellings on fire, she couldn't move. We don't know if the men were fueled by their domination over the town or if they were simply not paying attention, but they set fire to Chisholm's hut with Margaret Mackay still inside. Janet and her neighbors fought the fires to get Margaret out, but she succumbed to her injuries just a few days later. Donald MacLeod, a stonemason who was living in Strathnaver when this occurred, wrote,
"Every imaginable means short of the sword or the musket was put in requisition to drive the knaves away, to force them to exchange their farms and comfortable habitations, erected by themselves or their forefathers, for inhospitable rocks on the seashore, and to depend for subsistence on the watery element in its wildest mood. The country was darkened by the smoke of burnings, and the descendants were ruined, trampled upon, dispersed, and compelled to seek asylum across the sea.
MacLeod recounts the long trek that the beaten and exhausted tenants endured, pointing out only a few of the children survived, deaths that were never counted in official documents. 2 years later, Sellor would be tried for Margaret Mackay's death and other injuries and deaths caused by his fires. With quite a bit of witness testimony against Sellor, his defense gathered the statements of officials present at the burnings to defend their tactics. In the end, the judge found Sellor innocent, ruling that he was merely performing his duties as the authority of the Sutherland estate, evicting the land in the name of agricultural progress. According to John Preble, the judge had this to say:
If the jury had any difficulty in striking the balance, then they must take into account the character of the accused. The implication was clearly that against the word of a man so nobly commended as Patrick Sellor, of what value was the evidence of a card, a thief, or a bigamist?
And so Sellor was free to return to his new estate in Strathnaver, where he continued to carry out evictions to expand his sheep pasture. The only change in his behavior after the trial was that he would wait to burn people's houses until they were evicted. Now remember, this was just one town on one estate during the Highland clearances. This was happening all over the Highlands. Clearances from the Sutherland estate went from 1811 to 1821, and it's estimated that 15,000 people were removed from their land to make room for 200,000 sheep. Most of the evicted tenants set up new townships on the coastal regions in Scotland. Here, they eked out a living through fishing and kelp farming. However, over time, the kelp prices dropped and the population grew as soldiers returned from the Napoleonic Wars. Reconstruction would be a slow and tedious process. With poverty on the rise, the crofters were about to face another catastrophe, the potato famine. To lessen the threat of starvation, the government forced landowners to pay famine charity to the displaced crofters still on the estate-controlled lands. Suddenly, no one in Scotland was prospering, and a new wave of clearances was about to begin. Crofters with fortitude and ability began moving to the lowlands where they could find industrial jobs. Other crofters went into indentured servitude to avoid starvation. Landowners who were hemorrhaging cash realized it would be cheaper to pay to send crofters abroad than it would be to continue paying charity funds. One example was Colonel John Gordon, a Scotsman who acquired land in the Outer Hebrides from Clan Ranald when the clan chief went bankrupt in 1838. When the famine hit, Gordon was losing money on his investment while also paying for famine relief. He turned to forced emigration to solve his financial issue. In 1851, the small township of Balnaboda, with less than 30 people, was marked for clearance. Hired thugs ran through the township and dragged tenants to the harbor and ferried them to Loch Boisdale. The tenants were coerced to attend a public meeting by telling them that they'd be tracked down by dogs and fined if they failed to attend. At the meeting, the tenants were informed they were going to Quebec, Canada, but they were assured that good living conditions and jobs awaited them there. Many boarded the waiting ship, the Admiral, willingly, full of hope. Gordon's agent in charge of the endeavor, John Fleming, cleared thousands of people this way. Fleming claimed that everyone would be met on the shores of Canada by immigration services and provided with farmland. Now, this is a lie, as evidenced by the letters between Fleming and the chief immigration agent in Canada, A.C. Buchanan. Sometimes Fleming didn't even bother to inform Canadian agents until the ships had already departed. Buchanan writes that all parties on the boat were impoverished. Many of them had insufficient clothing. Little, if any, spoke French, the native language of Quebec, so employment couldn't be provided. These immigrants would be forced to trek to other parts of Canada for work. Buchanan informed Fleming that the Canadian government could not afford to, quote, carry the freight of those who were interested in the removal from Great Britain of paupers and other unprofitable portions of the populations. He warned that if Gordon continued to send people, he should expect to see no Canadian government assistance for his evicted tenants. G.M. Douglas, the medical superintendent in Quebec, wrote, "I have never during my long experience at the station saw a body of immigrants so destitute of clothing and bedding. Many children of 9-10 years old had not a rag to cover them." The forced eviction from Gordon's land concluded that year. he cleared more than 2,000 people from the Outer Hebrides on 5 ships. Of the 1,700 transported to Lower Canada, only 600 were accepted as paupers and supported by the colony. The rest were reduced to beggary. Donald MacLeod, who had immigrated to Canada before this, interviewed the ex-Islanders and wrote,
"Hear the sobbing, sighing, and throbbing. See the confusion. Hear the noise, the bitter weeping and bustle. Hear mothers and children asking fathers and husbands, 'Where are we going?' Hear the reply, 'We know not.'"
So there you have 2 examples of the horrors of the clearances. These were especially nasty, but by no means were these unique. Rights and support for Highland tenants would not be achieved until the 1880s, and forced eviction wasn't legally eliminated until 1886 through the Crofters Holdings Act. It was based on a model created in Ireland by the Land League that gave tenants the right to fair rent, to free sale, and fixity of tenure. In other words, only the courts could decide what constituted fair rent. The tenants could bypass the landlords and sell their interest in the land to another tenant, and tenants could not be evicted if they paid their rent. Now, it's hard to arrive at an exact number, but it's estimated that somewhere around 70,000 people were driven out of their homes and out of their country during the clearances. At the start of the 18th century, roughly 30% of Scots lived in the Highlands and the Islands. By the turn of the 20th century, that figure was only 8%. To this day, only a few dozen people own most of the Scottish Highlands. Many of the islands belong to either individuals or corporations. In 1993, 2 farm families on the Isle of Arran were evicted and their houses bulldozed to make room for deer. There's no real happy ending to this story, but I'm going to put an ironic twist on it for you. Many of the evictees of the clearances immigrated to New Zealand, and as it happened, they brought with them one very valuable item: sheep. Today, odds are if you wear any piece of tartan, whether it's a kilt, a shawl, even a necktie, the mill who wove it for you probably got the wool from New Zealand. A tiny speck of poetic justice and a horribly tragic tale.